Today what we're going to be talking about is how to get that huge, large format console sound in your home studio. There's so many things that a big console does, not only for the sound of your music, but also for the impression on your clients, for the amount of money that you can charge. A large format console has a massive impact on all of these things, but today I'm gonna try to offer my advice on all the ways that you can get as close to the large format console thing and all of its benefits, its many, many benefits in your home studio. So I recently had a conversation with my buddy Sean about the pros and cons of a large format console. Now, after filming this conversation, I realized what would probably be a lot more helpful to you watching is if after every advantage that we discussed that a big console gives you, that I just pop back in and give you my take on how you can get as close to these things as possible in your home studio. Now, this was filmed at GearFest at Sweetwater in the Unreal Studio A. Sweetwater is sponsoring this video. There'll be links in the description for every single thing that I talk about in this video. And if you use those links in the description, it goes a long ways to help support this channel and help me keep making videos just like this one. So anytime you need any piece of musical gear, hop on any one of my videos, click any one of the links in the description, buy anything that you need. It goes a long way to support the channel, and I really, really appreciate it. Okay, let's flip over to my conversation with Sean and talk about the big first advantage of having a big console. This is Sean. We're in Studio A at Sweetwater. We are going to talk pros and cons of having a console.
Sure are.
In your studio. There's a lot to unpack here. There's a ton of massive pros, and there's some pretty significant cons. So let's talk pros first.
Okay.
First pro.
Pro. Sounds great.
It does sound great. It's a different thing. People that say that they're unnecessary sonically are wrong.
Yeah, I feel like it really adds like cohesiveness to a recording. So we got a whole bunch of preamps, a whole bunch of electronics. They're all built by the same people. So all of the music is going through that.
There's a similar flavor being imparted on everything.
Yeah, and that really kind of makes my job as an engineer a lot easier because I'm dealing with, a bunch of paintbrushes that sort of put this painting together of sound that, sounds great.
That's a great way to put it. The other thing I think that in terms of the sonics is there's lots of extra hardware, lots of extra transformers. There's just lots of extra analog circuitry that everything goes through that imparts character.
100%.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's something that a lot of people don't realize, when you hear about preamp modules being standalone or in a rack, they're not made for that. They're made to go in a console. So when you get a preamp EQ in a console going through the line amps and the rest of the electronics, that's kind of how all that stuff was designed. So you're going to get a better sound from doing all that stuff.
Totally. So how do we get as close to the sound of a console at home in your home studio without having a console? Now, obviously, there's a ton of plug-in emulations, console emulation plugins that are great, and that's awesome. I use some of those some of the time, and I think some of them are really good. There's one thing that I do and that tons of big mixers here in Nashville do that is kind of a secret. It's one of the Nashville secrets. A lot of us are mixing with a pair of mic preamps on our mix bus. Now, every microphone preamp has a different flavor and a different character, so I'm not gonna get too into what you should and shouldn't use. I use a pair of Cappy Hyder mic pre's. I've used other stuff in the past. I will probably use some other things at some point in the future. The important thing is that you get a stereo pair or two of the same microphone preamps and you put them on your mix bus. You run your whole mix out through these preamps and back in. And this imparts a character, gives you some transformer love, gives you more analog circuitry, and it really, really tames the digital harshness of a mix. This is one of the biggest impacts that you can have with hardware. If you have no other hardware that you're mixing with, but you have a pair of microphone preamps, real hardware microphone preamps, try sending your mix out through them and back in. But more importantly, mix through that from the very start. It makes an enormous difference. Now, the other big thing when you're mixing on a console is that every single channel has some character that's being imparted into the music. There's transformers and preamps, line amps, the entire bus system, the mix bus of the console. So how do we mimic that or get closer to that? One of the ways that I get around that is by when I'm recording, when I'm actually producing and when I'm tracking, I track with gear that is more colorful maybe than I would even want. If I can get all that color, all of that character, if I can get all of that in the recording process, then I don't have to do as much in the mix to get that big fat analog sound. And so most of the things that I record with here in the studio, my vocal mics, my microphones for acoustic guitar, for electric guitar, etc., my preamps, a lot of my stuff that I have here is very colorful microphones, very colorful preamps. And this helps me not have to worry as much about this in the mixing phase, because a lot of that big analog gooiness is baked into the sound. And I will even kind of overdo this sometimes in the tracking phase if I know that I'm not gonna put any hardware on that thing in the mix phase. And that allows me to just use a FabFilter EQ on that track when I'm mixing, because so much of that big analog character is baked into it. The next pro that I think is a huge deal is the speed at which you can work. I can mix a song way quicker on a console than I can with a mouse, and that's something that I think if people that have never really mixed on a console or mixed on a console enough to get comfortable and fast and efficient, it's hard to even wrap your head around how fast you can work.
Yeah, it's amazing. I love it. I think that it's probably my favorite thing as an engineer is to like get a mix going on a console. It's where I get to be sort of in a creative zone where tactile, can reach, turn knobs, especially being able to work with outboard gear and all that stuff. It's really kind of the most exciting part of the process for me if I get that opportunity on like an actual analog console.
Totally.
So.
And behind us, by the way, is this beautiful Rupert Neve 5088, which is a pretty unreal console. You work on this every day.
Yeah. No, I would say it's probably one of the best consoles available on Earth these days, currently produced. Obviously has some huge lineage with the Rupert Neve name on it. And I think it's a musical muscle car. It's pretty awesome.
That's a good way to put it, a musical muscle car. Speed on a mixing console. For those of you that haven't experienced it, this is a real thing. Once you're very comfortable on a mixing console, it is so fast. So how do we get you to that place in your home studio? There's a couple things. One, having your studio set up where it is completely streamlined, where everything that you need to touch during the mixing process is within arm's reach. You can reach all of it. And even a step further than that, the knobs that are most important to you, if you have a vocal EQ or whatever hardware that you have that you're tweaking the most, you want that as close to you as possible. And organize your hardware so that way the most important things can keep you centered in the sweet spot between your audio monitors, and it's within the closest arm reach. And the things that you adjust less, a little further away, and the things that you adjust even less, a little further away. I have my entire studio laid out this way. The next thing is having every piece of hardware, microphone, preamp, EQ, compressor, all of it, all on a patch base, so you never have to climb behind your desk. If you do need to switch something, you just swing over to the patch bay and switch your patches up and you're rolling again. Now, there are some more things that I definitely want to cover on this topic, but we're getting ready to talk about another topic that kind of ties into this, so I'm going to save some of this for a minute. What's another reason that makes your life easier or makes the end result better with a console?
It's impressive.
Okay. This gets a little off into the weeds, but I think it's something that needs addressed. When a client of yours walks into a room and they see a big sprawling console, that affects them. It affects everything about them. It affects what they're willing to pay. It affects their perception of the music. It affects their overall experience. I even often find, like if I go to some big pro commercial studio for a session, a lot of times I can actually get better performances out of people because they walk in and they see this and they're like, oh, this is for real. I got to be on it.
You hopefully, you can impress people with the looks and stuff, but it's like, it sets the bar, right? Like you're in a studio, there's a console, it's big, it's imposing, it sounds good. All of that stuff hopefully brings the whole thing together. So it feels more, I don't know, it just makes people
feels
inspired.
More pro.
Yeah, I mean, and when you get a bunch of people around it, there's sort of, I don't know, like a sense of like people are working together, especially if you're doing, a mix, people sitting in front of it. But, if you're sitting in front of your mouse and keyboard and clicking away by yourself, it's kind of like you're in a little personal zone. This is definitely, gives the space. People can sit at the console with you, which I think is a really cool thing when people kind of cruise up beside me and sit there and can see me work and listen and stuff. So, I don't know. It's that part of it really kind of makes the whole process a lot more fun. So
Yeah, and there's a human element to that as well. Usually if you're somewhere that has a console, you're not the only one in the room. Most of the time there's an assistant, an intern, something else happening.
Yeah.
And so there's like a human interaction instead of
just being stuck in a room by yourself for hours on end.
Which is nice. It's nice to be creative with people. That's the whole
Yes.
thing. Is like hopefully you're connecting with someone and making something awesome together.
Now, nothing is quite like having a big console in your room. I had a big console for many years. I've had several of them, more than one. And when people walk into your studio and there's a big console sitting there, you get a reaction from them that is unlike anything else. But there are a few ways to set up your home studio in a way to get closer to the same reaction from your clients and from the people that walk in your room as they would get if you had a big console in there. Now, the first thing that will help give people this impression is when your studio is really well laid out, when everything has its own place. Nothing is cluttered, nothing is jumbled, because when you walk into a studio that has a big console, there's not room for a bunch of crap everywhere. So what I have done here in my room is every single thing has its own place. All my power supplies for my microphones, they have their own place. All of my cables, they have their own place. My headphones have their own place. All the gear has its own place. It's not just stacked around on top of each other. Everything is neatly put away in its own place. The next thing is your acoustic treatment, making sure your acoustic treatment is professional or looks professional if you built it yourself. Nothing will give people a more home studio or less professional vibe when they walk in your room than if the fabric on your panels is all wrinkly and not done very well. You want to make sure that everything is as pro as you can possibly make it look, even if you're doing all of it yourself. And for those of you that have been following the channel, you know I'm a big fan of this. I've done all of this in my room myself, but I put a lot of extra time and effort into making sure that this room looks as professional as humanly possible. The next thing is your desk that you're using in your home studio. Now, it doesn't really matter how much gear or how little gear you have, but having a desk that is a studio desk, having it clean at all times, no clutter on it, having everything in its own place, and having a desk that looks like a real professional desk. This goes a long, long ways to giving people the impression that they are in a very professional environment. I've been rocking this Danger Fox desk for a long time now. Side note, there's some new additions coming, so stay tuned. We're gonna kind of do a new makeover of the studio. But I've been rocking this Danger Fox desk for a long time and I really love it. It's a great desk and it gives people a very professional impression when they walk in the room. Not quite the same as a console, but it's about as close as you can get.
One thing that I think a lot of people don't realize about consoles is, especially in the early days, it was a performance. Like, there would be multiple people on the console at the same time and they'd hit play. There's multiple engineers writing the faders and like you're performing. And even though we don't do that a lot, there's automation in a lot of consoles, there's not necessarily multiple people always on the faders at the same time. It's so much more of a performance.
Yeah.
Mixing is a performance when you're mixing on a console.
Well, yeah, and then you can get, getting the musicians involved too. Like, it's like, hey, you grab the fader that's got your solo on it and you turn it up, ride that,
Yeah.
So it can be something where the people that actually recorded the stuff then become part of the mixing process, and then that whole collaboration makes everyone feel more involved in the process, which I think, yields a better result when people are actually collaboratively creating together.
Yeah.
So I think that sort of allows for, just hopefully a better end product. I mean, obviously there's people that are very much attached to super fine-tuned digital automation, but an analog passive mix on a console without automation is something to behold. So
It certainly is.
Mixing on a console is a performance. This is a real thing. This is a big deal. And for those of you that haven't had the opportunity to mix on a console and get comfortable on a console, I can't overstate how big of a deal this actually is. Now, there's a couple ways that I think that we can get closer to this in your home studio, regardless of how much hardware that you have. Now, one of the things that I think we should all do, regardless of if you're going after a big console sound or not, is limit the quantity of options that we have. If every time you go to put a new EQ on a channel, you are choosing between 78 different EQ plugins that you have, you're doing yourself a disservice. You're 100% doing yourself a disservice. The amount of time that it takes you to even scroll through them is hurting your mix. It's hurting your perspective. It's taking you longer, which is keeping your ears less fresh. There's a lot that goes into this. So limiting the quantity of things that you have, I think, is a big deal. Every single mix that I do has like 3 or 4 different EQ plugins on it. That's it. 90% of the EQs that I use is between two things. It's the FabFilter Pro Q3 and the Brainworks SSL channel. That's 90% of the EQ that I use in every single song. Same with compressors. There's 3 or 4 different compressors that I use in every song. There's only a couple of different reverbs that I use. Limiting your choices lets you just get to work. Make the song great. That's the most important part here. Not, oh, I used 47 different EQs on this song. That doesn't matter and it doesn't help you. And if I was a betting man, I'd say that any person that's using 47 different EQs on their mix, probably not that great of a mix, because they were focusing more on the tools and not the song.
I think the next thing that is really a big deal is the quantity of things you can have set up simultaneously. In the live room now, there's a whole drum kit and a bunch of guitar amps and synthesizers and I don't even know, piano. Like there's a whole bunch of stuff in there ready to go.
Yeah, we're ready to rock. So like, I don't know, I've worked with a lot of different bands that have a lot of different, pieces of the puzzle. So we have drum kits and keyboard rigs and guitar stuff and different guitar stuff and acoustic things and vocals and all that stuff. And when you're on a large format console with a number of channels, you can have all that stuff up and ready to go.
Yeah.
And at your fingertips. You're not like, oh, there's a rack of preamps over here or whatever. We're like, it's right in front of me. It's all there.
Yep.
I can like turn it on, and all that stuff while staying in front of the speakers, which I think is a big thing when you're sort of diving around or crawling around at racks to try and get levels and stuff set. When you're sitting in front of the console and you can, at an arm's reach, get stuff dialed in is super awesome. So
100%.
The quantity of things that you can have hooked up at the same time when you have a large format console is a big advantage. So how do we get as close to that as possible? I've done my best not to just tell you guys to go buy a bunch of gear in order to make this happen. This is unfortunately a situation that it's a big deal, it's a huge advantage, and you have to buy some gear to make this happen. You don't need a console necessarily though, but you are gonna need some microphone preamps. So what I do here in my room, and I'm real close to this, I'm not quite large format console territory, but I'm getting pretty close. So here in my room, I record vocals all the time, I record acoustic guitar all the time, electric guitar all the time, bass guitar all the time, keys all the time, and kind of a variety of other electric and acoustic instruments, but really these things. Now I'm commonly using stereo pairs when I'm recording acoustic guitars and electric guitars. So what I've done is I've done my best to have enough microphone preamps that I don't really have to be pulling cables and changing settings all that much. I know that this pair of microphone preamps over here, this is what I record electric guitars on 90% of the time. And this pair of microphone preamps, this is what I record acoustic guitars on 90% of the time. And this preamp, this is what I record vocals on 90% of the time. So analyzing how many things you do in your room on a consistent basis, and then trying to find the preamps that you like the best for that thing, and then those preamps get dedicated to being that thing, and you find something else for another thing, that really can move you a long ways towards this having lots of things hooked up at the same time. Of course, having patch bays is a big part of this as well. You want every input and output of every single piece of gear and every input and output of your interface on a patch bay. This is a big pain. It's not cheap to buy all of this cabling. The patch bays aren't crazy expensive. I'll put links down below to the patch bays that I use. But this really goes a long ways to streamlining your setup and making things faster. It's faster to switch between acoustic guitar and vocals. I don't need to pull a bunch of cables and readjust my preamps. It all gets set up at the same time, and then we're in our creative space. We're just creating music, and I'm not worried about pulling cables, hooking things up, using different preamps. I've only got one preamp or two preamps that I have to use for everything. Now I realize that this is a long journey. It takes a long time to build up a collection of gear like this, but I would encourage you to invest in your setup because there's a lot of advantages with this.
Let's talk cons.
yeah, okay.
Because there's a couple.
Yeah.
Obviously, the first one we really have to talk about is price.
Yeah.
It's a massive investment, and I would like to say that it's an investment because when you buy something like this 5088, like that's generally a lifelong purchase.
Yeah.
Like you're in this for the rest of your life. This is your career, but they're not cheap.
No.
So what are your thoughts on where you have to be in order to justify?
I think, obviously if you're in a situation where you're making the primary income from making music and this is like a move to get the best possible tool for the job, or if you're a business as a studio that appreciates the large format console factor and can turn that into paying customers coming in your door. I mean, that's something that is going to set you apart from other people that don't have a centerpiece like this that really kind of establishes.
Yeah. My thoughts on how you can justify, if you can justify a console is, and this is something that I think about when I think about putting a console in my room, which I've thought about many times. Can I get more clients with it? Can I charge those clients more money? Can I work faster or better? And the answer to like 3 of those needs to be yes.
Yeah.
3 of those 4 questions need to be yes, I think. But if they are 3 of those 4 questions yes, then there's a real, it's a real option.
If you can justify get a return on your investment and not make it a money pit, I mean, that's something that, the investment of, hundreds of thousands of dollars into something that hopefully can help you turn a profit and make successful product come out of your studio, then that makes sense. But all of those pros and cons have to be weighed.
100%. So. Space, I think, is another con.
They're big.
Yeah, they're big. You got
large format console.
You have to have a big room, which means you've already invested heavily into a studio. When I built my last studio back in Illinois, where I'm from, I specifically made the control room large enough to house like a 60-something channel console. And I was trying to think ahead. I didn't have the money to buy one then, but it was like, this is where I want to end up, so I'm going to do this now. I think stuff people don't think about, HVAC.
Yeah, I mean, the heat it throws off, the power it consumes, wiring for that sort of stuff. There's a lot of infrastructure that goes into a console. Like, there's a lot of routing, and
a lot of cabling.
All that's got to show up on the patch bay. So you got a lot of patch bays, a lot of cable, a lot of space, a lot of heat. So it's...
What's the power cost to run something like this? The whole console will run 12 amps. So this probably gets in... We're kind of going to take a little side note here. This kind of gets into, like, modern consoles. An old SSL 4K.
Yeah, you're looking at $1,000+ a month.
$1,000+ a month just for power consumption. Actually, in nowadays power, probably $1,500 or $2,000. Yeah, so like these older consoles, that has to get weighed into the conversation about whether it's worth it. I think the point is these new consoles are really, they've made huge strides in being power efficient. 12 amps.
Yeah, you can plug it into the wall. And that's enough. It's not like it used to be. And I mean, that's something to consider. Like, I mean, one of the other cons is maintenance, but like trying to maintain old power supplies that draw a lot of electricity when you're dealing with a new console, that's figured out and a little bit more efficient. Obviously, it's not going to hurt the pocketbook as much when you're plugging it into the wall and you're not drawn.
In 2 ways, less maintenance and less power consumption.
Yeah.
Another con, to me, the next biggest con is recall.
It doesn't have that.
What's recall? So
do it again.
Yeah, do it again. So how do you recall this, or do you?
I don't.
You don't.
No.
It stays up until it's approved.
Yeah, if I'm mixing, and I started early on. One of my first big purchases, I bought a Yamaha PM2000 and modded it, and like got really into the weeds of that. And that was sort of, I was mixing through that, and I couldn't recall. I tried many times, and I could never get it there. So I'm pretty accepting of the inability to make it exactly the same. And if I'm working with a project or with an artist that I'm going to do an analog mix with, I will get it to a point and have them be here. I try to make sure I set the expectations that, like, hey, we're going to mix this. If you don't like this, we're probably going to have something that sounds slightly different. It's not going to be the exact same with a small change. So, I mean, that's something, there's a lot of consoles that have automation and total recall and stuff like that, but our console here does not, and I kind of approach it in that way.
Well, and I think most consoles do not, right? Like the ones that do are like very high dollar consoles. And then automation would be the next thing. In terms of recall, you do a mix, for those of you that don't know, you do a mix and you're done with the mix, and then you send it to the client, and then you wait for them to let you know what changes they would like to have made. And on a console that doesn't have recall, that means that like maybe the knobs are in a completely different position, and how do you get those knobs back to the exact same position when you go back to working on that song? And
it's a tedious. I mean, you can do it. Obviously, you can take notes, you can get
photos,
all that stuff to recall. But it's like that's such a tedious process. The creativity that I get out of mixing in an analog format sort of supersedes that. Like if that's
Yes.
what I'm going to do, that's the whole move, is to try and get something inspired out of it.
Yep.
If we're getting into the weeds about doing super small changes and stuff like that, I might even flip mid project and just be like, I'm going to mix this in Pro Tools.
Yeah.
And then work on that. We also have
So the old stories of like the A&Rs, like, can we get the hi-hat up a quarter dB? Yeah, that doesn't really work in this world.
no, and we have in all of our studios we have summing mixers, the
Got it.
5057 satellites. So we
So when you're not on the console, you're still getting this
yeah,
flavor.
we can pump out 16 channels into a Rupert Neve summing mixer, so we
Nice.
get some of that sound. So like, I mean, I got to kind of make that decision and understand what the workflow and expectation of the artist is. So we kind of, you know, we feel it out. The fact that if someone does want a remix of something you've done, hopefully you can beat your previous mix.
Yeah, and there's also something about like your fresh perspective when you step away from a song. When you start mixing a song, I have this theory. The moment you start mixing, you also start losing perspective. And the longer you work on a mix, the less perspective you actually have. And so sometimes stepping away from a mix or mixing it again can give you significantly better results.
Yeah, well, that's 100%. I totally agree. I feel like that's something, you know, you latch onto things you like, you dislike, you hyper focus on stuff that doesn't matter, and you get into the weeds, and you're like deep into it. Someone walks in and goes, "Man, that sounds great," or "Why does that snare sound like that?"
Right.
And like you're like, "I didn't even notice that." And
Exactly.
then you kind of switch. If you get an opportunity to pull all the faders down and start over, sometimes that's a great thing.
Yep. I've got one more con. If you have a console, you likely have a bunch of outboard gear. So in my studio, I have a mastering style desk, you all know, and I can stay in the same way as you can on a console. I can stay right in the sweet spot and reach everything. Generally with the console, the racks are either way out on the side, or like in this case, they're behind you. You have to turn around to reach stuff. That would be a con, not being able to stay in the sweet spot while you're mixing everything.
Yeah, I use a lot less outboard gear than I normally ever would if I'm
That's
mixing
a-
on a console.
That's a great point.
So I focus more on what's in front of me.
Yeah.
And if I need something, you know, if I'm plugging in 1176 or a distressor,
Yep.
you know, I can kind of get it ballparked and go back and forth a bit. But for the most part, when I do have a large format console, a lot of that stuff is happening on the console. I find myself having to do less processing to get what I want because of the sound I'm looking for is from the console. So
Excellent. If you guys want to see more about this Rupert Neve 5088 or any of the gear in this studio, there'll be links in the description down below. Make sure you go check it out. There's lots of cool stuff here. Go look at some of the cool stuff here. Thank you, Sean.
my pleasure.
Appreciate it. Thanks, guys, for watching. Make sure you subscribe. Drop me a comment. Let me know your thoughts if it's something you would ever consider. I just want to hear from you guys. And if you want to book a session here,
Yeah.
Sweetwater Studios is open to book. So if you want to come record here at Sweetwater at this ridiculous studio and have this wonderful man work with you,
Let's make some music.
I'll put a link to your Instagram down below and like a contact for Sweetwater Studios. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one. Peace.